lachem, ani Adonai Elohechem.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah emet v'chaye olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Reuben ben Abraham B'Sarah Yashniya.
Page 694, verse 5.
Baruch Adonai Baruch.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Olam Va'ed.
Baruch Adonai Baruch Olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kibashanu asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
V'chi tizbechu zevach shlamim l'Adonai l'tzonechem tizbechuhu v'yom zivhachem yechel mimocharat v'anotar yom hashlishi ba'esh yisarei v'im he'echol yechel v'yom hashlishi v'guhu lo yiratzeh v'yochelav avano yisak ye'kodesh Adonai chilel v'nichreta ha'nefesh hahi me'ameha uv'kutzrechem eketzer artzachem lo techalep yatzadacha liktzor V'leke katsiracha lo tilakate, v'charmecha lo te'oleh, uferet karmecha lo tilakate, le'ani v'lager tazovotam, ani Adonai Elohechem.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah v'chaye olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Ya'amod Aharon. Aharon ben Harav. Menachem Tuviyadeh. Nancy Layash Lishit.
Page 695, verse 11.
Baruch Adonai Baruch.
Baruch
Baruch Adonai Baruch Olam Va'ed. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Lo tignovu, lo tichachashuv, lo tishakru, ish b'amito, lo tishavu v'ishmi, la shaker v'chilalta, et shem Elohecha ani Adonai, lo tashok erecha v'lo tigzol, lo talin pulat sachir itcha ad boker, lo tikalel cheresh, lifnei ver, lo titen mikshol, v'aretam Elohecha ani Adonai.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher natan lanu Torah tevet v'chaye olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch Atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Need a chair. $221 in the Lev Shalem. Yalu et Shem Adonai, ki niskaf Shemo levado, hodot v'shamayim v'yarin karen li'amo, telachol chasidav, livnei shalom b'ro hallelujah, leDavid, mizmor l'Adonai ha'adonai. Yuzem melech hakavod, Adonai tzvoru melech hakavod, Selah. teshuva, Kadesh Yameinu Kekedem. Yitgadal v'yitgadash Rabba v'yamad yivrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayechon v'yomecho u'chaydecho beit Yisrael b'galav v'zman kariv v'yimeru ameh yehi shemer Rabba mavorach le'olam ameh omaya yibarach v'yishtabach v'yitparchuma v'yitnasei v'tadar v'talev v'talal shmena gudusha richu v'lam yagol brachata v'shirata v'tav v'nechmata damiran be'alma v'yimeru ameh. The Amidah for Shabbat afternoon is 2:23 in the Lev Shalem. It should be right after the Torah service and the other Sidurim if you've been following along. If you're still davening, please continue at your own pace. We begin the repetition 2:23 in the Lev Shalem. Remain standing for the Kedusha 2:25. Adonai spatai tiftach, ufi yagid tilatecha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'lo Eloheinu Elohei Abraham Elohei Yitzchak Elohei Yaakov. El Agdol Hagibor v'Yano Ra Yon Gomel Chasadim Tovim Konei Yaakov Zocher Chasdei Avot. Umevigo Elev Neven Hen Laman Shema V'Yava Melech Ozer Moshe Umagen Baruch atah Adonai. Again, Abraham. Tagibor lelam Adonai mechem etim atarav lo Shia marid hatam mechalkel chaim meches mechem etim rachamim rabim. Sumech nachlim rofech cholim atir asurim mekayem emunato lishnei afar michamocha b'agavar d'mido melech melech meimitum chayem atzmiach Yeshua v'namanot alachayot meitim baruch atah Adonai mechayei hametim. Kadeshim Habolam Kashem Shematu Shemato Bishmei Marom Kakatu Vayad Neviyecha Vekarazeh Elzeh V'yamah Kadosh 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 Adonai Tzvot Mochel Aretz Kevodo L'Matam Baruch Yameru Baruch V'Adonai Mikmo Derei Kod Shecha Katuv Lemor Melech Adonai leolam, Elohai Etzion lador vador, hallelujah, lador vador, nagid godlecha, ולנצח נצחים, קדושתך נקדיש ושבחך אלוהינו, מביאו למוש לעולם ועד, כמלך קדוש וקדוש אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, האל הקדוש. אתה חי בשמך אחד, ומקמך ישראל גוי אחד בארץ, תפארת גדולה, ועטרת ישועה, יום מנוחה וקדושה לעמך נתת, אברהם יגל, יצחק ירנן, יעקב ובניו ינוחו בו, מנוחת אהבה ונדבה, מנוחת אמת ואמונה, מנוחת שלום ושלווה והשקט ובטח, מנוחה שלמה שאתה רוצה בה, יכירו בניך וידעו כי ימינך היא מנוחתם, מנוחתם, יקדישו את שמך, אלוהינו ולבתינו, רוצה מנוחתנו, קדשנו במצוותיך, ותנחם בתורתך, צווינו בטובך ושמחנו בישועתך, ותהר ליבנו לעבדך באמת, והנחילנו אלוהינו בעבר רצון שבת קודשך, ונוחו בה ישראל מקדשי שמך, ברוך אתה אדוני, מקדש השבת, ורצה אדוני אלוהינו, במך ישראל להביא תפילתם, וישב ודלת בביתך, וישי ישראל תפילתם, וגמרת ברצון, ותהי לרצון תמיד, עבדי ישראל עמך, ותחזינה עינינו, בשמך שם ברחמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, המחזיר שכינתו לציון, מודים אנחנו עכשיו ולעולם. אני פלותך ודורתך בכל עת ערב הבוקר וצהריים, תאכל רחם 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 כאילו תמך חסך מעולם קיווינו לך, ויעל כולם יפרח, ויתרום שמך מלכנו תמיד ללמד, בכל החיים ידעוך סלע, ואלו את שמך באמת על ישועתנו בעזרתנו סלע, ברוך אתה אדוני, הטוב שמך לך נאה להודות, שלום רב, הישועמך תשים לעולם, כי אתה מלך אדון לכל השלום בטוב בעיניך. לברך את עמך ישראל בכל עת ובכל שעה בשלומך, ברוך אתה אדוני, המברך את עמו ישראל בשלום. יקדש יקדש מרבה, עמד יברך את ימים מחמתי בחייכון ובמכון וחדר וביסו בגלל בזמן קריב אמרו אמן, יהי שמר ומבורך. לעולם לעולמי עלמיה, יברך וישתבח ויתפאר שמה וינצח, ותודה ותלה ותלש ולקדושה בריחו, ולמה כל ברכתה ושירתה, שבותה ונחמתה דמירן בימי ואמרו אמן. תקבל עצותינו ואותון דחוי, שפל גדם הני ושמיה ואמרו אמן. שלום רב מן שמיה וחיים עלינו והכל שלום ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום ומרומה, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל, אמרו אמן. עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה לייצר בראשית שלא עשנו גויי ערב. ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהן, וגור עלינו ככל עמונה, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא שנותן שמיים ויוסף מה שתקרא בשמיים, ושכינת זה וגבהי מברנו. על כן נקווה לך אדוני אלוהינו ביומיהם, אבל תדבר ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא אדוני אחד ושמו אחד, קדישתו מורנר's קדש. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, ילמד יברח חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכון וביומייכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה בזמן קריב יאמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם לעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה, תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמה ויאמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה, וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומך, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו amen. Ruchim to you, Shakach to Marshall for laning. For those who are here in person, there is a light Sudashli sheet over the side. Go get some food. We'll start the learning in about 5 minutes. If you're joining us on Zoom, just give us about 5 minutes for people to get food, and then we'll start the class. The text sheet was sent out in the Shabbat email. So if you, hopefully you have it from there, or actually it was sent out both in the Shabbat email and the special email that was announcing this series. So it should be available to you digitally. We'll start in about 5 minutes. Shabbat shalom, everyone. I underestimated the crowd tonight, which is always a nice thing. So probably there are 3 sheets for every 4 people. So if you're here with someone, share with them, please. Good Shabbos. It's actually nice to be back in Pilch Hall. Before COVID, this was the most oft used room in the entire institution by both school and shul. And we really have not been in this room because as we moved indoors, we moved first into the larger spaces. I'm not even sure why tonight was scheduled in here. I guess it was the indoor space that was most conducive to both davening and eating in the same space. But it's nice to be back in here. I'm glad everyone is comfortable being here. Welcome to those on Zoom. Once again, we're represented around the country. We have our local Beth Amers on Zoom. We have some of our members from San Antonio, Texas, and we have, I want to welcome, she's still here, our friend Terry, who we met in Natchez, Mississippi. She was our hostess at the synagogue in Natchez, Mississippi, and has been coming to some of our classes and services. So welcome, Terry. It's so nice to have you a part of our community across the time zones. This is part 1 of a several part series that might turn into a longer part series if there's interest. And it comes via the Hartman Institute, a think tank and thought leader in the Jewish world, both in Israel and the United States, who does many, 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 many things. One of the things they do is produce curricula. And they're particularly adept at producing curricula that would be interesting both for scholars and rabbis to dive into and first-time students of Judaism. Because they don't shy away from core traditional texts, nor do they present it in such a way that makes it anything but accessible to those who are just thinking about Jewish ideas for the first time. And this is a new curriculum, I think, called Foundations for a Thoughtful Judaism. And it's basically a high-end and thick and rich, not quite an intro class to Judaism, but a reintroduction to Jewish principles. Some of the texts that you'll confront if you're here all the weeks, you've seen before. And one of the arts of Jewish study is to look at something that you've seen, you can probably even quote by heart, and come to it with a second naivete, as if you're reading it for the first time, which is a challenge, but a beautiful challenge, right? We can do that with one another as well. We've known each other, some of us, for years and decades. What is it like to confront the other almost as if it's an entirely new encounter? So what's it like, as we're going to do in a few minutes, to confront Lech Lecha as if we don't really know the story of Avram and his being sent on this journey of faith? So tonight's class, which we could turn into a 2-hour class, but we're clearly not going to, is to start to focus in on the question of what faith is in the Jewish tradition. And there's almost a pre-question, like before we get to Avram, and before we get to God, and before we get to Heschel and Maimonides, it's interesting just to consider in our own minds what it even means to say that we believe something. We use that phrase all the time. How does a belief get into our minds? If you want to get neurobiological, what is a belief? Is it a neurotransmitter firing? Do we believe something because we know it to be true? And why do we know it to be true? Because we accept an expert? Or we imbibed it organically from our upbringing? Or we were here and we were convinced there? And just think about that scientifically. What does it literally mean in the brain to have believed this, and I read something, or I heard something, and now I believe that? Could you trace that in the mind? Right? The mind is a non-corporeal reality that is based in something very bodily, right? So there might be a time in future scientific inquiry where you could actually, and this is both wonderful and scary, trace a thought. But what does it mean to actually say, I believe that, or I believe in? By the way, Professor Minha Goodman, who also is on the Hartman Institute, says that there's a very important distinction between believing in and believing that. Believing that is binary, because if you believe that, then you're either in or out, depending on what community you're part of. Believing in is open-ended and vague, right? And so we sometimes get into trouble in American thought and in religious thought. We say, I believe that. But if we're all in the category of I believe in, then we can have a serious conversation with each other. So what we're going to be looking at is the biblical core text for how belief begins. And then if we get to them, 3 different possible responses, one from the medieval era, one from the modern era, as to how it might come to be that we believe in anything, in particular, that we believe in a God, in a creator, in a prime mover who's responsible for everything that we're experiencing and who's a glue for our religious experience. So let's start from the beginning. It's the first source. It's on page, well, it's the first page. It was on page 3 in the booklets. Verses that I know that you've confronted many times. And here are the questions that I want you to think about as we're reading through these verses. Is there anything in these texts that suggests why God chooses Avram? And is there anything in the text itself, not what you conjure about it, anything in the text itself that suggests why Avram says yes? And is there a mystery in this text? And is the mystery in this text in any way a window into what the faith experience can be? Let's read it as if for the first time. Vayomer Adonai el Avram. By the way, this is the first verse of the first parsha after Parshat Noach. So the main narratives we've had in the Torah so far are Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah, Tower of Babel, and some genealogies. Right? Some other stuff as well, but this is the first time we're having an encounter between God and a human that has to do with being in a relationship, as opposed to simply setting out basic principles of life. Vayomer Adonai el Avram, God said to Avram, there was no precursor to this, Lech Lecha, take yourself or take for yourself. It's unclear if the Lecha is understood as like a direct object or something having to do with this is for your benefit. Me'artzacha, from your eretz, from your land, umi moladetcha, from the place that you were born, from the word holad, which means to be born, umi beit avicha, and from the house of your father. For the moment, particularly if you're like Rashi students, like don't Rashi this. Try to take a meta approach, not how come it says your land, your birthplace, and your house, your father's house isn't that the same thing? Those are interesting questions for a midrash class, but we're trying to look at it from a broader theological perspective.
What are the main lessons that are being conveyed here? So go from all these places, El Haaretz, to the land, Asher Areka, to the land that I will show you. Ve'ezcha lagoy gadol, I'm going to make you into a great nation. Va'avarechacha, I'll bless you, whatever that means. Like we translate va'avarechacha into the word bless, not that really demystifies what the notion of a bracha is. Va'agadla shemecha, I'll make your name great. Ve'heyeh bracha, you will be a bracha. It's unclear if that last two line is what's the word? A command? What's the word for command? But in English. Imperative, thank you. Or if it's a prediction. Is it a be a blessing, exclamation point, or I predict, God says, that you'll be a blessing? Those who bless you, I'll bless. Or those who curse you, I'll curse. And through you will be blessed. Who? Kol mishpachot adama. All of the clans of the land will be blessed through you. The next verse, for some reason that I cannot explain, came out backwards in Hebrew. So if you're good at reading Hebrew left to right, Vayelech Avram kasher diber. Avram went just as God said. Kasher diber elav Hashem, just as God said. Vayelech ito Lot and his the Avram ben Chamesh. I'm not going to try to do it backwards in Hebrew, but we can do it in English. Avram went forth, and the Lord commanded him, and Lot, his nephew, went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran. Okay? A few more verses. Vayikach Avram et Sarai ishto. Avram took his wife Sarai. V'et Lot ben Achiv, and Lot his nephew. If we were doing Rashi style, we'd wonder why Lot was mentioned twice in the previous verse and in this verse. All of the stuff that they had accumulated, midrashically, that's understood as converts, by the way. Rashi brings that what did they acquire? They acquired people who were seeking along with them to find greater meaning in the world. Similarly, all the souls that they had made in Haran. What does it mean to make a soul? Maybe it means to convert. They left to go to the land of Canaan. They left and they arrived. Vayavor Avram ba'aretz ad makom Shechem. He went down into the area of Nablus, northern Samaria. Ad Elon Moreh, to the terebinth of Mareh. V'haknani az ba'aretz. There were Canaanites in that land. Always complicated when you get to a land and there are people already there. But we'll gloss over that for now. Vayera Adonai el Avram. And there was another revelation. God appeared to Avram by Yomer and said, L'zaracha tenet ha'aretz hazot. I'm going to give your land, this land, to your offspring. Vayiven sham mizbech, he built an altar, Ladonai, to the God Hanireh Elav, who appeared to him. Vayatek misham hahara, kind of moved on towards the hilly area, mikedem lebeit el, east of Beit El. Vayet ohalo, he pitched his tent. Beit El miyam b'ha'ai mikedem. Vayiven sham mizbech, he built another altar, Ladonai. Vayikra b'shem Adonai, he began to invoke God's name. That's a lot in 8 verses. A call, an agreement, a taking his family, a planting himself, and even within the new land, he has several different locations that he calls his home, and he begins to call out to God. Okay, so from the text itself, not from your childhood or adult thinking about the text already, is there any indication in the text as to why God chooses Avram and why Avram chooses to have faith in this voice that comes out from the heavens? And if there's mystery in this story, what is it? And how does it relate to the question of faith? Those are the questions on the table. And if you're on Zoom, you can, if you want to answer, please let me know if you have a question or a comment. What do you guys think? Yes, and I'll repeat for the Zoomers what each person says here. Edward. So what Ed says is that it's possible to read the story suggest that God chose Avram, but God could have chosen, Shlemiel to his left or Shlemiel to his right. There's nothing in the story that suggests something unique or special about Avram. Midrashically, we read into it, he was already a proselytizer for God. That's the Kol HaNefesh Asher Asu B'Charan. But God picked this guy kind of almost not accidentally, but it could have been anyone, and a relationship was formed. Larry and then Diane. Really interesting. So what Larry reminds us of is that already we know the character Avram is not anchored to a particular place, and maybe this is an indication that faith begins with someone who's already willing to be on some kind of a journey, who's not overly loyal to staying exactly right here. That there's a dynamic to faith. Diane. Wonderful. So Diane's saying two things. I'll just reverse them. One is this is the Torah, the story the Torah chooses to present. It doesn't mean it's the only story that happened, right? I mean, think of any scene in the Torah, and even lean into it as the notion of it having happened in history the way it's presented the Torah, which of course people can have different positions about. It doesn't mean that everything that happened in that moment in history is presented, right? Certainly not everything that happened between Joseph and his brothers at the pit is being recorded in the Torah. We're getting a terse presentation. So perhaps what we're being recorded is the first time God tapped on someone's shoulder and the person said yes. And the first thing you said is that that even if Avram doesn't know where the place is, God has foreseen or has imagined where this faith journey is going to take Avram, and God feels comfortable tapping on this one shoulder. Deborah? Hmm. Uh-huh. So what Deborah's saying is that the language of the call is sensitive to the fact that Avram may already feel not connected to his birthplace, not connected to the place of his father. So by naming that, it heightens the fact that Avram at the time needs to go somewhere else. This. Sorry, Steve. Thank you. Yeah. Hmm. So what Steve is saying is that there's a strategy here that God picked an influencer, right? Like had like 10,000 TikTok followers, and it was an Avram was a Steve is doing an etymology of Avram, which is not said explicitly in the Torah, but those who know Hebrew roots can play with it. Av, father, Ram, high, exalted, and that the strategy here was choosing someone who could share the message far and wide. AJ? Chabad. Yeah. AJ is pointing out that even though the call comes to Avram, as they move from Haran down to Canaan, they're already a small clan, a family business. They're the first shlichim. It seems to me that while we can guess, we don't obviously know exactly why God chose Aram. We don't know why Avram chose to follow God, but we do know that Avram was what I would call radically obedient. He doesn't even ask questions, right? This is that character of Avram not asking questions is brought out with greater clarity in Parshat Vayera, where there's a contrast between his radical, frightening obedience in the narrative of the binding of Isaac, contrasted with a willingness to push God in the story of Sodom and Amorah, right? Moving down the number of people who are righteous, who are required to be there to save the cities from 50 down to 10. But in this scene, all he does is say yes and follows. And if Avram were to tell the story, if we were to bibliodramatize this, if we were to conjure Avram, right? Say, Avram, you were hanging around in Haran. You were on the move already, but you were hanging around, and a voice told you, I'm God, I'm going to make you great, and you went, and we asked Avram, why did you go? It would be really interesting in a bibliodramatic moment to find out what the answers were. So here's my question to you before we go to some kind of attempts to anchor a faith experience in certain criteria. Is anyone here willing to go into their own history and share their Avram moment? Because we all got here on some level, right? We all got to a place in our life where some aspect of belief and faith is present, right? It may be for some that nation of Israel and people of Israel and community of Israel and Knesset Israel is more important than Elohei Israel. But it's hard to fathom a traditional Jewish community with a notion of faith in the God of Israel being completely absent. Right? So is there someone willing to share where you would pinpoint in your life the moment of the experience that most closely mirrors this, where you went from not being on a path where God is present to on your way to Eretz Israel? Diane? Literally, yeah? Wow. So we have actually, in some ways, a real Avram and Sarai amidst us, right? It began with a professional opportunity, a sabbatical. And on the sabbatical, God, I'm going to use God as a filler here, which is a weird thing for a rabbi to say. But God called on you on some level and said, this is where you ought to be. And you literally picked up and went from Haran, Ohio, right, to back to the land of Israel. So that's a radical transformation. And I would say a radical obedience to some inner call that's not completely rational. I was being gentle. Yeah. 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 So remember what Diane said when, and hopefully if we get to the Heschel quote later on in the class, but there was some call that pushed against rationality to say, I don't belong here, I belong there, and there's something bigger operating this system than just I. Good. Anyone else? Yes, Irv.
Not so much on that, but I've been on very long marches, and I read one of the interpretations I think here. I realized different takes and some been presented by some people in different forms. It wasn't so much that he was going; it was to go on this journey where you inform people at every stop about one God. That's really what the trip was about. People did the same thing for the union organizing at the Caesar Chavez stop. So it said meetings then in March. I only marched to confess on Sundays, but the rest of the gang marched for 25 days. And each stop told people about the union and everything else. So this trip was to tell people about one God. And it was something he decided to do. Not the journey, not who told him to do. He was the one who spread the gospel, so to speak, like some later predecessors
Uh-huh.
also did.
So we were talking about long marches for justice or great causes, journeys where there's a momentum, there's a like a stone gathering great moss as people come to the truth that particular action represents. Look at the next text. And again, this one shiur we could do 3 or 4 times as long as we're going to. But I want to be able to see if we can get at least briefly to all 3. This is source 2. It says page 4 on your source sheet. And I'm going to read, normally I like calling on people, but because I want to make sure that everyone on the Zoom, if they don't have the text in front of them, hear the text, I'm going to read it. This is Aviva Zornberg, one of the great teachers of Torah alive today, originally British, based in Jerusalem, teaches around the world. This is her take on Avram, and this is what I'm going to posit as one of 3 possible, among many, things that can anchor one to one's faith experience. Here begins the journey of Lech Lecha. For the first time, a journey is undertaken not as an act of exile and diminution, and she puts in parentheses Adam, Cain, and the dispersed generation of Babel. I'm just going to interpolate here an interesting observation that there have been people sent already out from their home base several times in the Torah, but this is not in order to get them out of somewhere, but now as you can say, get them to somewhere, but as a response to a divine imperative that articulates and emphasizes displacement as its crucial experience. Displacement as its crucial experience. That could be an interesting phrase just to meditate on in terms of how that relates to our faith experience. For what is most striking here is the indeterminacy, great word, of the journey. What is left behind, canceled out, is defined, clearly circled on the map of Abram's being. He left something known. But his destination is merely, quote, the land that I will show you, from your land, the landscape of your basic self-awareness, to a place that you will know only when the light falls on it with a difference, which is a lovely turn of phrase, right? So Avram is being asked to leave something concrete, known, rational, familiar, and being sent somewhere new, but the newness will only become clear when it's pointed out at some indeterminate moment in the future, right? These are the kinds of journeys that are both, it depends on, do you feel, like if one feels like, I hate to get mundane, is a road trip the most extraordinary thing in the world where you start driving, you're not sure where you're gonna end up? Or is that unsettling for people because it's hard to be away from something that is known? Midrash Tanchuma, which is a rabbinic commentary, espouses this view of Abram's first trials. Quote, is there a person, with incredulity, who travels without knowing to what destination he travels? A journey without apparent destination, absurdity at each step. This resonates with what Diane was saying before. The Midrash gives us mocking voices that weave through Abraham's consciousness as he travels. Look at this old man, traveling through the country, looking like a madman. How would you sum up Zornberg's take on Avram and the faith journey in a sentence or two? What's the pshat, the simple reading of what Zornberg is saying? Rabbi Chaim.
Feels like sort of, I'm not sure if you use this term, like an axial moment, where there is a transition in society from nomad living, Bedouins, et cetera, which stuff like this was quite normal, quite usual, to sedentary life where you build around yourself and build up a society. This is a moment where it's going backwards.
Mm.
And we need you to go back to what you used to be
Mm.
because something really important is going to happen here. I can't tell you exactly what it is, but I need you to go back and do what perhaps your ancestors were doing 3 generations before you.
So what Chaim is saying is that maybe Zornberg is reading this as almost like the flow of a river going backwards. If the sweep of human history is to move from nomadism to creating fixed places on earth, the first message to Avram is to almost go backward into being a Bedouin. Travel to a place, you're going to pitch your tent in many different places. The constancy will be me and my relationship with you. Larry? Okay. The pshat of Zornberg. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So what Larry is saying is that Aviva Zornberg's read of this, both admiringly, because Aviva Zornberg is a devoted devotee and penitent of the faith tradition that comes from Avram. She's a very frum woman, but that it began with a certain amount of madness. If I may, the same madness we attribute to people of newer faiths who go around espousing truths and then acting on those truths of faiths that are born only 50, 100, or 350 or 600 years ago, right? We ascribe a certain madness to that, right? She's saying, if we're honest with ourselves, there's something mad and absurd. The softest way you could say it is irreconcilably mysterious about this. There is nothing known here. Just go do it, right? The moment in my life where I felt most Avram-like through the prism of Zornberg was at Lev's Bris. At Lev's Bris. I had, as a rabbi, officiated at, 100 brises and reading the party line and celebrating and mazel toving and reassuring the parents that, there's barely any pain and the moil is very good and it's all a good thing. And I remember I have this 8-day-old child and I'm about to hand him over to Rabbi Waknin, and I almost couldn't do it. I almost couldn't do it. Like, what the hell are you doing to my child? My child is fine the way he is, right? And it was really hard for me. And the way I think about what permitted me, I hope it was the right thing to do, to hand over Lev to the moil was Zornberg's read of Avraham. I didn't know this particular text beforehand, but there is an absurd madness to it. And on the other side of that is a door that leads to meaning and long-term connection to what, across space and time. But there's a nervousness. There's a nervousness when you're following a certain mad intuition with no rational proof that it's the right thing. Right? And that's also, by the way, one of the things that differentiates faith from living a purely philosophical life where everything can be proven or at least attempt to be proven. Larry? Right. Right. So what Larry says is that this is a Rav Soloveitchik explanation, or at least description, of putting on tefillin or any other, daily ritual practice that looks bizarre to an outsider, right? Lulav, etrog, anyone, right? Hoshana Rabbah. No, that makes sense. What are you talking about, Joel? That the only possible explanation for why we're doing it is that we're embracing a benign, wondrous madness. Tom. Great. So just for those on Zoom, that Tom is distilling Zornberg's read of Abram as the move from the known to the unknown, which Tom, as a writer and a teacher of writing, associates with the mind of the artist and the creativity of the artist. Just because that's an important inflection point, I know there are other hands up. Look at the next text, because the Rambam, Maimonides, whom Zornberg knows well, reads it almost entirely opposite, right? Particularly as we think about what Tom said, the move from the known to the unknown. So this is one of the many places that the Rambam talks about the core of faith. And the Rambam, Maimonides, 12th century, early 13th century, Spain and Morocco and Israel and in Egypt. Philosopher, Aristotelian philosopher, and rabbinic sage and halachic sage and mathematician and scientist. This is the section where he's talking about idolatry, but he actually goes into the story of Avram and his emergence from idolatry. Again, I'm going to read just so that people who are on Zoom who may not have the text have it. Those wise men of that era, the Rambam is not using the word chachamim here the way that the Talmud uses the chachamim. These are not the rabbis. These are the people who were considered to be wise pre-Avram. Kagon kohanehem, like their priests or the leaders, uchayotze behen, medamin she'ein sham Eloha. They had this impression that there was no God, elah kochavim, except for the stars, balgalgalim and the spheres, the planets, shenasu atzurot ha'elu biglalam uludmutan. That the gods associated with those celestial beings had kind of made all the images that we see. Aval tzur olamim, the rock of ages, right? The eternal rock, one of the many names for God. Lo haya shum adam shaya makiro. No one knew that God back then. Velo yodo, did not know of them. Ela yichidim ba'olam, except a few people. Kagon Chanoch, this would take a long time to unpack, but certain biblical characters where there's some mystery about their existence in a few sentences or two in the early chapters of Breshit. Chanoch and Metushelach, Methuselah, Noach, Shem ve'Ever. Noah, and Shem and Ever, two descendants of Noah. V'al derech zeh haya olam holech. And on this path, the world continued. And I would add, continued without any certainty that it would ever change. And I sometimes think about that. I recently was in Utah on a biking trip, and I'm looking up the mountains in Zion Canyon and thinking about the hundreds of millions of years that the rocks were there that had no idea we were coming. Right? Like didn't know we were coming. And it was infinitely more likely that we never would have come than that we came. That the rocks were just going to be the ones that were there, and they weren't going to know that they were there, but they would have been there anyway. Right? So the world could have gone on like this, according to the Rambam, shrouded in the non-knowledge of what he says became known. Ad shenolad amudo she'olam v'hu Avram Avinu, until Avram was born. So according to this first source, Maimonides seems to think that there was a radical lack of knowledge of that which really should be known, and there was something cosmically significant about Abraham's birth. He's going to read Abraham as not just an eeny, meeny, miny, mo, but someone who figured out something important. Next halacha. Kivan shenigmal eitan zeh, when this great man was weaned, hidchil lishotet batato, he began to think. Interesting, like lishotet can mean to to explore. It can also mean to like hover over water. He began to go on these mental explorations. V'hu katan, he was still a kid. V'idchil lachshov, he began to think. Bayom u'v'layla, night and day. Bayat tamea, he wondered. Hey ach efshar sheyeh hagalgal hazeh. How could it be that this sphere, noheg tamid, was always behaving as it does? V'lo yelo manhig. It's an interesting play, and it's better in Hebrew than English. It was noheging, but there was no one manhiging. It was acting, but there was no one acting upon it. Or how could it be there's no one acting upon it? Umi yisabevoto, who was spinning it? Right? Interesting awareness of the spinning nature of the earth. Ki efshar sheyisabev atzmo. It couldn't be that the earth was spinning itself. Velo hayalo melamed. No one taught him. Velo modia. No one gave him this knowledge. Davar. Ela mushka be'ur kasdim. He was stuck in the pagan, yuckiness of Ur of the Chaldeans. Bein of kochavim, amongst the idolaters. Hatibshim, the not so smart ones. Va'avivi mo, and his father and his mother, nice people, but they didn't know from God. V'chol ha'am of kochavim, all of them were idolaters. V'hu ovedim ahem, he was worshiping with them because it's hard to pull away from your milieu. V'libo mishotet, but his heart was wondering. Umevin, and understood. Ad shehisig derech ha'emet, until he captured a certain pathway of the truth. Vehevin kav hatzedek, and he learned this kind of line or pathway of righteousness. Mitfunato hanachona, because of his own preternatural ability to imagine, understand things. V'yadash yesh sham Eloah, he figured out that there was a God. So this is actually a radical read of Parshat Lech Lecha. It's almost as if the Rambam is saying it's not that God called Avraham, but Avraham called God, or Avraham became aware of God, and Avraham uncovered God. That's not what the text says. The text says God taps Avram on the shoulder. The Rambam says what it means is that Avram finally became aware that there was a God tapping on his shoulder. Sheyesham Eloah Echad, there was one God, V'hu Manhig, this God is the operator, Hagalgal of the earth, V'hu Bara Hakol, create everything, Ve'ein B'chol Haninsa Eloah Chutz Meno, there's nothing in the world of creation besides this God. The Yadash Hakol Halam To'im, and understood that everyone else is making a mistake. V'dagvar shegaram lehem litot, and the thing that caused them to make this mistake, zeh she'ovdim et hakochavim, is that they divided the cosmos and they worshipped the stars over here, v'hatzurot and the sculptures over there. Ad she'avad ha'met midatam, the truth that could have been accessible to them got obliterated because they had divided their faith experience amongst almost anything they saw. Uvein arba'im shana, he was 40 years old. Hirkir Avraham et Boro. Avraham understood his creator. So I set up the Maimonides text in contrast to Zornberg. If we take Tom's view of Zornberg, that Abraham's path was from the unknown to the known, Maimonides would say back to Zornberg, as it were, 700 years before Zornberg, what? Sorry, from the known to the unknown, right? Maimonides would say back to Zornberg, it's the opposite. That what was this faith journey? From the radical lack of knowledge about how things actually were, finally to the one truth that needs to be known, right? The science of faith and not the art of faith, right? The conclusiveness, the clarity that this is the only thing that makes sense for understand how the world is to be. Right? Now, I'm not sure that Zornberg, the student of Torah, like would disagree with Rambam directly, but she understands the beginning of faith to have been in a different direction. And Rambam was a scientist and philosopher. And for Rambam, it doesn't make sense if you don't break through the notion of the prime mover and say, why do I believe in this? What else could I believe in? Right? Stephen Hawking could have a very strong response to the Rambam. Right? There's another answer in the world of physics, but Rambam didn't know physics. Rambam just knew there had to be some explanation for all of this that was comprehensive, and not that it was divided into different, fiefdoms of the universe. Reactions or thoughts on the Rambam? Because I want to get to Heschel briefly before we close. What's that? Thomas Kuhn. I don't know the name. Uh-huh.
One theory then takes over another. I won't go into the details, but it's somewhat similar to what the Rambam is saying.
To those on Zoom, Larry is saying, go read Thomas Kuhn. Okay, yes, Joel.
I think the Rambam is not only talking about Abraham, he's talking about all of us. All of us who have faith in God, right? It isn't just because our parents brought us up to believe in God. We have to go through this intellectual process where we come to the conclusion, yes, there probably is a God. Otherwise, the world wouldn't be what the world is today.
Right, so Joel is saying that if we place ourselves in the Avram mode, Rambam is saying that at some point, mystery will hit up against a wall. Unless there's something you can discern through the cloud of the mystery that makes sense to you, you're going to jettison it. Right? That's true when we go through, the reconstruction of our family narrative and our national narratives. Right, at some point, the mythos of the United States of America, and the mythos of Zionism, and the mythos of our family of origin will break apart unless we can come back to it with a sense of, not only have I inherited this as mother's milk, but it actually makes some sense. I can actually stand behind it. I can hold this flag with a sense of certainty, and if not certainty, clarity and confidence. It's not just, I don't know, but I'm following the voice. Let's look at Heschel, because we're getting late. Heschel, 20th century philosopher, some people call him even a prophet, really the greatest articulator of the experience of the person of faith in the last 100 years, at least from the Jewish perspective. It's the last page of the source sheet. It says page 6 on it, from one of his many books that gets into this. Man is not alone, a philosophy of religion. Authentic faith is more than an echo of a tradition. It's a creative situation, an event. For God is not always silent, and man is not always blind, which I hear him saying as, there are times when the portal is open, but it's not frequent. In every man's life, and he means every man and every woman, there are moments when there's a lifting of the veil of the horizon of the known, opening a sight of the eternal. This is him pushing a little bit against the Rambam, right? It's beyond what is known. into something which he's calling eternal. Each of us has at least once in his or her life experienced the momentous reality of God, to which I would say maybe each of us has experienced it, but he's inviting us to think back through our life and maybe even read back into moments where we might have missed it. Each of us has once caught a glimpse of the beauty, peace, and power that flow through the souls of those who are devoted to God. But such experiences or inspirations are rare events, going back to Larry. But if you're a davener, you daven every day knowing that you might not have this experience tomorrow or next week or next month, right? To weave them all together, right? You go on this Zornberg pathway, not knowing what's going to happen. In a Maimonidean way, you have a sense that there's some purpose and some truth coalescing all these things together, but you're not sure when the revelation is going to come in a Heschelian way. To some people, they are like shooting stars, passing and unremembered. And others, they kindle a light that is never quenched. And I think there he's referring to people who have epiphanies that don't last, and people who see the light and then they live their life that way till the day they die. The remembrance of that experience and the loyalty to the response of that moment are the forces that sustain our faith. That sentence deserves to be read again. The remembrance of that experience when the portal was opened and the loyalty to the response, meaning staying true to what you felt you were experiencing in that moment, are the forces that sustain our faith, are the things that keep us putting on tefillin, touching the mezuzah, and being involved in this whole journey. In this sense, faith is faithfulness, loyalty to an event, loyalty to our response. And he would say that the core response is not Avram actually, but Sinai, that the Jewish faith experience is loyalty to our people's record of what they experienced at Sinai. In 37 minutes, we're not going to, come to any grand conclusions about our faith journeys. But it is interesting to think about how infrequently, even in a traditional shul like ours, we actually talk about this stuff. We go through the motions a lot, right? And I don't think the motions are meaningless. I think the motions are meaningful. But we don't that often as a community go down to the core questions of what do we believe, why we believe it, when did we start believing it, what might stop us from believing it, and what are we willing to do along the journey, even in those moments that we question that belief, and might a revelation be coming? So I hope if you continue with this series throughout the weeks between Pesach and Shavuot, there might be some mini revelations along the way. Next Shabbat, we're taking a break from the series that we just began, because next Shabbat, Yonatan Rosner, our Judaic Studies principal at Pressman Academy, is teaching along with me at Sudash Lishit in memory of kind of a belated shloshim for his father who passed away in Israel about 5 weeks ago. But after that, every Shabbat afternoon until Shavuot. Shabbat Shalom. And we'll go to Kaddish Rabbanan and then Mariv and Havdalah. Birkat Hamazon. Let's do Birkat Hamazon first. Joey, do you want to lead Birkat Hamazon? Can you come up here and do it? Yeah. Thank you for reminding me.
Shir Hamalo Peshuv Adonai et Shivat Zion Hainu Kecholamim Azimale Sachok Pinu Ulshonenu Rina Az Yomeruva Goim Higdil Adonai La Sotimele Higdil Adonai La Sotimanu Hainu Semechim Shuva Adonai et Shavitenu Kafi Kimba Negev Hazorim Bedima Berina Iktoru Haloch Yelechu Vacho No Se Meshech Hazara Boyavo Verina No Se Alumotav Chavi Rein Varech Yehi Shem Adonai Barach Metav Edolam Birshut Maranan Rabotai Nevrech Elohim Shechal Nimi Shalo Baruch Elohim Shechal Nimi Shalo Tuvo Chayinu Baruchu Baruch Shemo Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Hazan Etolam Kulo Betuvo Bechein Bechesed Uvrachamim Hu notain lechem lechol basar ki le'olam chasdo. Uvtuvo hagadol. Tamid l'chasar lanu ve'ayachsar lanu. Mazon le'olam va'ed bavur shemo hagadol. Kiwelzan farnes lakol. Umetiv lakol. Umechin mazon. Lechol beriotav asher bara. Baruch atah Adonai Hazan et hakol. Nodel Adonai Elohim Elohim Chatov. Rachem Adonai Elohim. Ritzi v'achalitin. Shulchan zeh Rachmanim.
So we finished benching. We're going to say Kaddish to Rabbanan after the Torah study. It's on 111 in the Slim Shalom. In the Lev Shalem. Yitgadal, v'yitgadash, Shemei Rabbah, v'yalmad yivrach Yerutei, v'yamlich malchutei, v'chai echon, v'yom echon, v'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, v'galav, v'zman karim, v'imru amen, Yehi Shemei Rabbah mavorach, le'olam, le'olam maya, barach v'yishtabach, v'yitpa'ar, v'yitromam, v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar, v'yitalev, v'yitalel, Shemei Kudusha, B'richu, Leila min kol berchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran be'alma v'yimaru, amen. Al Yisrael, v'al Rabbanan, v'al Tamidehon, v'al kol Tamidei Tamidehon, v'al kol man daskin be'araita, diviatra hadein v'di b'chol atar v'atar, yehi lahon ulchon shlama rabba, china v'chista v'rachamin, v'chayin arichin, zona ravicha, uforkana min kodam avohon divishmaya v'imru, amen. Yehi Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya, V'chaim Tovim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen. Oseh Shalom Ramav, U'brachamav Yaseh Shalom, Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen. We rise for the Baruch of Mariv 264 in the Lev Shalom, 200 in the Slim Shalom, 281 in the Slim Shalom, 200 in the Sim Shalom. Thank you, Joey.
Baruch et Adonai Hamvorach. Baruch Adonai Barach Leolam Vaed. Umavir Yom Umevi Lav Du Ben Yovin Lado Nights Hochamo El Chai V'Kayam Tamim Lochan Leolam Vaed. Baruch et Adonai Amavi Varavim. Avat Olam Beisam. ועבדתך תשים ממנו לעולמים, ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל. שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. אדוני אלוהיכם אמת, ואמת הכספכם על לינקים. ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם, משה ונצחנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו להם. מי כמוך בנים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש נטילות אוסף אלה, מלכותך ובניך בוקרם לפני משה, זה אלי אנו ואמרו. אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר כי בדנה יעקב וגלו מיד חזק ממנו, ברוך אתה אדוני גאל ישראל. שכיבנו נשמה מדיננו. ושמור צאתנו ונלכים לשלום אתה ועד עולם, ברוך אתה אדוני שמע ישראל לעד. ברוך אדוני לעולם, אמן ואמן. כי מלכות שלך ימתים לו בכבוד, כי אין למלך אלא אתה, ברוך אתה אדוני, המלך בפקודותיהם ימלוך לעולם ועד ועל כל מעשיו. יתגדל ויקדש שמי רבה, בעמד יברכו תבניך מלכותי, בחייכון ובימיכון רחד וכל בית ישראל, בגלה בזמן קריב עמו, אמן. ישמע ברך לעולם לעולמי, יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתעלה שמי קודשה בריחו. לעילא מן כה בחטא ושירתה תשפטה ונחמתה דמון בעלמא ועמו, אמן.
The Amidah said quietly, we are now in Rosh Chodesh, so please add in the paragraph for Rosh Chodesh towards the end of the Amidah, and also the inclusions for the end of Shabbat.
Chatzi Kaddish. If you're still davening, please continue at your own pace. We continue with the Chatzi Kaddish on page 279. יתגדל ויקדש שמי רבה, בעמד דבק יותר נכמחותי בחייכון ובימיכון וחידכו בישראל, בגלה בזמן קריב עמו, אמן. איש ברבה ברח לעולם ולמי עלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפר ויתמר ויתנשא ויתהדר וידלה וידלה שמי קדושה בריאו, לאל אמין כה בחטא ושירתה תשפטה ונחמתה דמן בעמה ועמו, אמן. Bikra eni v'eni amu anuchi betzara achalzehu v'abdehu orchim asbeu v'eu bishuati orchim asbeu v'eu bishuati. Kadosh, 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 and atzvo melech haaretz kvodoho. Vatisa eni ruach v'shmacha v'korash gadol, baruch v'Adonai mimkomo. Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. Titen em le'Yakov chesed l'Avraham asher nishbat al avotenu mimei kedem. Baruch. ויבדחו בחיידי שמך ולא עזבת דרשך אדוני אדוני חפץ למען צדקו יגדיל תודה ויאדיר. יתגדל ויקדש שמי רבה בעמד דבק ותבליך מלכותי בחייכון ובימיכון וחידכו בישראל בגלה בזמן קריב עמו, אמן. איש ברבה ברך לעולם ולמי עלמיה, יתברך וישתבח ויתפר ויתמר ויתנשא ויתהדר וידלה וידלה שמי קדושה בריחו, לאל אמין כה בחטא ושירתה תשפטה ונחמתה דמן בעמה ועמו, אמן. תתגבר צלחו וברכון תכו ישראל כאדם ולשמיה ועמו, אמן. יש שלום רבים שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועמו, אמן. עושה שלום עממה ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועמו, amen. Yesterday was 14. Counting of the Omer, page 63. Muchanum zuman, hineni muchanum zuman, hineni muchanum zuman, hineni muchanum zuman. Kayem mitzvat aseh, hineni muchanum zuman, shel sfeifat haomer, hineni muchanum zuman. Lachem egvata Shabbat imeni muchanum zuman Yom aviachem et omer hadnufa hineni muchanum zuman Sheva Shabbatot remoti ena alma mechvata Shabbat tisberu chamishim yom Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat haomer. Hayom 15 yom shehem shnei shavuot v'yom echad laomer. Today is the 15th day of the Omer, which is 2 weeks and 1 day of the Omer.
Back to Elena because we haven't done enough flipping back and forth tonight. 281.
Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol et gedolah liotzer b'reshit shelo asanu guye aratzot lo tzamanu gemishperot adama shelo savrelgenu kahem v'gor aleinu gerol hamonam אנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לבני מלך מלכי המלכים קדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר וירא מלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא ירא אחד ושמו אחד. קדיש יתום. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבם. בעלמא דברה קירותי וימליך מלכותי בחייכון וביומייכון ובחיי דכל בית ישראל בגלה וזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם אלומי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשה בריחו לעילה מן כל ברכתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירן בעלמא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיה וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. ברוך תהיה.
I once know how to turn the lights off in this. Is that those lights over there? Yeah. Hey. הנה אל ישועתי, אפתח ולא אפחד, כי עזב וזמרת יד, אדוני ויהי לי לישועה, ושבת מים בששון, ממעייני הישועה, לאדוני הישועה. על עמך בחסדך סלע, אדוני צבאות עמנו, משגב לנו, אלוהי יעקב סלע, אדוני צבאות, אשרי אדם בהותיה בך, אדוני יושיע, המלך יעננו ביום קוראנו, ליהודים הייתה אורה, ושמחה וששון, ויקר כן תהיה לנו, כוס ישועות אשא, ובשם אדוני אקרא, יין עיני, יין עיני, 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 ברוך אתה למחולם בורא פרגפן, ברוך אתה למחולם בורא מיני בשמים. ברוך אתה אדוני מחולם בורא מיורא האש. ברוך אתה אדוני המחולם הדיל בין קודש ובין החושך בין ישראל עמים בין יום השביעי לשש ימי המעשה. ברוך אתה אדוני המבדיל בין קודש לחול. המבדיל בין קודש לחול, חטאותינו ימחו. זרענו בכספנו ירבה ירבה כחו, וככוכבים בלילה. זרענו בכספנו ירבה ירבה כחו, וככוכבים בלילה. Eliyahu Hanavi Eliyahu Atishbi Eliyahu Hanavi Eliyahu Eliyahu Hanavi Eliyahu Atishbi Eliyahu Hanavi Eliyahu Agil Ay be mehera yavo elenu Imashiach ben David be mehera yavo elenu Mashiach ben David. Shavua Tov, everyone. Good luck. Can at least one person on the way out tell the security guard that I need about 15 minutes before he locks up at my office? Just, I don't want him to lock it up on me. Thank you. Shabbat Tov, Zoomers. Shabbat Shalom, Natchez. Shabbat Tov, San Antonio. Shabbat Tov, Betham. Shabbat Tov, Toronto. Tomorrow, Minyan tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. And Chodesh Tov, happy almost ER.